Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. It's wonderful to see you all here. I know that we can't see everyone, unfortunately, but it's great to know that there are so many of you here. And thank you for joining. Some quick housekeeping issues. We would love to hear from you throughout the session, so please feel free to provide your questions through the Q&A function. And just to be very brief to kick things off, I'm Kai Merce. I lead the engagement team within the UNFCCC Secretariat. Today, we are here to launch the public consultation on the future of Race to Zero. Race to Zero is the non-state actor branch of the Climate Ambition Alliance, which was launched by Chile at the UN Secretaries General Climate Action Summit in 2019. This global campaign is rallying non-state actors across the global economy to take rigorous and immediate action to have global emissions by 2030 and deliver a healthier, fairer, zero carbon world in time. All members are committed through their partner initiatives to do the same overriding, reducing emissions across all scopes swiftly and fairly in line with the Paris Agreement, with transparent action plans and robust near-term targets. In this session today, we will hear from the two high-level champions, Gonzalo Muñoz and Nigel Topping, on the current status of Race to Zero and on the need to bring all climate action ecosystems together to shape the future of the campaign. We will also hear from Tom Hale, Associate Professor at the University of Oxford, who chairs the expert peer review group. The group, the independent body, which reviews partner applications to Race to Zero and which guides the criteria for the campaign. He will remind us of the criteria refinement process. We are also very lucky to have other expert peer review members here today who will walk us through some of the key aspects we want to discuss in this public consultation. With that, I have the pleasure to hand over to Gonzalo, who will reflect on where we stand on Race to Zero today. Over to you, Gonzalo.
Thank you so much, Kai. It's really great to be with you two in this such an important webinar. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone that is now joining. As I was referring to, we're not only glad, but very proud to be here. We feel that this is such an important, absolutely fundamental and critical milestone for the Race to Zero as a campaign, as a concept, as something that is putting together so many efforts, and we need to see it progress in the best possible way. Of course, we have seen over the course of the last year a dramatic shift in momentum behind robust net zero targets, in particular thanks to our Race to Zero partners who have been driving the growth of the campaign across regions, sectors, and all different actor types of the global economy. Our partners and members are recognizing that decarbonizing as fast as possible is not only a societal obligation, but crucially a commercial expectation and the only future path to grow. We tend to see how net zero is becoming a kind of new standard, a new norm. We have already seen some very impressive action taken by our members with the support of the partners, and we feel the hope around that. We, of course, want to continue accelerating this action taking and support the implementation of the robust commitments that have been made. And already all of our members have to meet very rigorous minimum criteria, which of course Tom, who heads up the expert peer review group, will walk through later during the session. And beyond these minimum criteria, many members and partners are leading with higher ambition and radical action. We are, of course, using this opening session and this consultation itself to bring you all on board and hear how you think we can continue enhancing the campaign to have emissions by 2030. We totally understand, recognize, and are focusing our energy on the importance of having the emissions by 2030. So we continue to strive to make this campaign as global as possible. We recognize we are still not perfect in this domain, but we really want to gather inputs from across all corners of the world throughout the next 10 weeks to hear diverse perspectives on how to best support impactful climate action across the globe. So now I would like to pass on to my dear friend and colleague Nigel Topping to outline in more detail the process itself and the content of this session. Ayo, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Gonzalo, and let me echo Kai's welcome, and it's great to see so many people on the call, and echo you in saying that I really do think this is a critical milestone for the campaign. Like you, I've been thrilled with the amazing work of so many partners to build so much momentum, but also very aware of the need to build on that. So I think this strong participation in this call is a great indicator of what I hope will be a really broad public consultation that we're launching today to build on the, when we launched the Race to Zero, we knew it wasn't perfect. We knew we'd have to keep refining the criteria. So this is about building on that process, which Tom Hale, who will speak about it in a moment, led in the first part of this year, which has led already to us clarifying and improving the technical criteria of the Race to Zero. What we really want to do now is look at how we can best support the implementation of those commitments. The main purpose of this process is to strengthen the campaign beyond COP26, to really help the work which is Gonzalo and my mandate, and which is part of hundreds of organizations in the Marrakesh Partnership all around the world, working with non-state actors to accelerate the transition to a zero carbon economy. To do this in this public consultation, we want to explore 4 key areas which we recognize are challenging but essential to get right in the coming years. First of all, how do we create, how do non-party actors, how do businesses and cities and investors create verifiable plans? And how do we judge verifiable plans? So not just the targets, but the content beneath them. Second of all, how do we track action? I mean, we have transparency as a requirement, but how do we measure impact? And remembering that there are many people who've been doing this for a long time, but it's very complicated. Thirdly, how do we encourage or incorporate the policy engagement aspect of Race to Zero members to ensure that there's real integrity? In other words, that how do we manage the risk of somebody committing to do one thing and then advocating for policies that are inconsistent with that? And finally, how do we support the members and hold them accountable to their commitments? So in this meeting, we're going to hear from our independent expert peer review group members. And again, I want to thank them. They are the backbone of this work, and they contributed a lot of time and decades of expertise. They're going to lay out the context and the guiding questions for each of these topics in a moment. We're not attempting to answer these questions today, but to present the issues so that it's very clear what the questions are we're asking for your feedback on. This consultation is also designed to bring us together across the climate action ecosystem. We don't all have to agree on everything, but we are all agreed we've got to get to zero fast. That's why we called it a race. And so the more we can converge and be aligned, the stronger our collective action is. So we want to move forward, recognizing the leadership of existing Race to Zero partner initiatives, but trying to bring us all together as aligned as we possibly can be. So listening to each other is going to be crucial. So please, we want to hear from you in the feedback process. And particularly if you feel an ability and a desire to lean in to support one of the 4 areas in particular. We are circulating the link to the written submission form in the chat and on the website. And you have until Friday, the 3rd of September, I think that's 10 weeks, to submit written submissions. All submissions will be published on the Race to Zero website, so we'll be completely transparent. We're asking for constructive engagement, but that can be constructive criticism. We really need to know what needs to be improved. All responses will be reviewed by the Climate Champions team, by the Race to Zero partner initiatives, and by the UNFCCC. And a closing session to outline the findings from the written submissions will be held in mid-September. Based on the feedback, we as champions, with the engagement of the Race to Zero partners and through consultation with the UNFCCC and the expert peer review group, will then lead a process to launch the next steps of improvement of the Race to Zero involving all relevant partners. So we're really, really grateful to all your involvement. I see more people still joining the call, which is good to see. But now I want to hand over to Tom Hale. And Tom, I have to say, before I hand over to you, a huge thank you to you for stepping in to provide that independent expert leadership and for putting together the expert peer review group. So Tom, over to you.
Thank you so much, Nigel. Thank you, Gonzalo. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I'm going to say a few words about the current approach in the Race to Zero campaign to the criteria process and the credibility of the campaign. And the watchword that's going to run through this brief update is really a word that I've locked into my brain because Nigel and Gonzalo say it so often, over and over. It's a phrase that many of you will be familiar with, this idea of radical collaboration. And I think that's what I've actually seen emerge through the Race to Zero campaign so far, and also what I think is going to be really important for this next round of consultations and making it succeed. This idea of getting this whole diverse community to come together to discuss the hard issues and to make progress on them together. And that's what's really going to make it powerful. But let me first say where we've got to so far. So as I think most people joining the call will know, the Race to Zero campaign has a set of criteria that partners joining the campaign, networks and initiatives through which cities or businesses or states and regions are making pledges, making commitments. Those are the networks and initiatives that we are applying the criteria to. And the process happened as follows. So before the campaign even launched in spring of 2020, when you may remember the world was really in the first months of what turned out to be still continues to be a grueling pandemic. But in those critical first months, when things were very uncertain, the champions said, we want to have a campaign about mobilizing more commitments, but we need it to be credible. We need it to be science-based. So we need a process to bring together the entities setting net zero targets, the scientists outlining pathways for those entities to follow, and the civil society groups that are thinking about how to mobilize these commitments and hold people to them. We need to bring all these different organizations together and think about what a credible, ambitious, forward-driving net zero or zero-focused campaign could look like. And so very kindly, the champions invited us at the University of Oxford to convene a set of meetings around that. We had about 8 sessions in the spring of 2020, all online at a time when that was kind of new and different, and we were all learning to adapt to that. And through that, about 60 or 70 different organizations who emerged to be the partners of the Race to Zero campaign came together and thought about what does it mean to set a credible target for this urgent, scientifically mandated goal of reaching zero emissions by the middle part of the century. And from that process, 2 outcomes emerged: a set of criteria and 2 leadership practices. So the criteria are basically the procedural steps that any organization needs to ensure to make sure that its pledge, its plan, its announcement is going to really be credible. It's going to have the robustness to deliver on this promise. And those 4 criteria are, conveniently, all start with P. Pledge, make a pledge to reach net zero emissions by the middle part of the century, and by including halving emissions, contributing a fair share to the halving of emissions in this decade. Have a plan to do it, to proceed on that plan, to take actual steps toward making it, and of course, to publish your progress toward that goal over time. And those are sort of the procedural ones, but alongside them, we have 2 what we call leadership practices, which are, that first consultation came out as scope and what we called offsetting. So include scope referring to all the emissions being covered, and offsetting being a credible approach to make sure that offsets were aligned to a net zero pathway. So that first set of criteria and leadership practices was one outcome of those discussions. But the second one was the formation of this expert peer review group, which I have the pleasure and privilege of chairing, which is dedicated to reviewing the applicants who join Race to Zero against those criteria and against those leadership practices. And the expert peer review group is this independent body of people who are either working for organizations setting net zero targets, or who are scientists studying the pathways to net zero, or who are civil society members trying to advocate for credible climate emissions reduction pathways. And so each of these people brings a different insight, different perspective to that question, and provides the high-level climate champions advice on whether different initiatives that propose themselves to Race to Zero are meeting the criteria of the campaign. So that was the first iteration. But one of the most important things I think the champions decided in the launch of Race to Zero was that this was going to be an ongoing process, because of course, we're not going to have all the answers in the first instance. And so they committed to review those criteria every year. And indeed, we did that again this spring of 2021, sorry, Northern Hemisphere spring, January to March of this year. And this time was a much larger process. Actually, we had about 200 individuals and organizations having discussions over about 8 sessions. That led to an update to those criteria, which strengthened them and clarified them, added a bit more detail, I think, to some of the questions that had arisen in that first learning, responding to the learning we had from the first few months of the campaign, and also added a further leadership criterion on empowerment and equity, which we'll say more about in a moment. But the outcome of that wasn't just a new set of enhanced set of criteria, but also 2 other things: a Race to Zero lexicon, which was an attempt by our community to try to decide and indeed align on some of the language we use to talk about this challenge of racing towards zero, where we try to provide an interpretation of key phrases like net zero, absolute zero, climate neutrality, et cetera, to help converge some of our thinking. And the third output was an interpretation guide to the criteria. So the expert peer review group has published this interpretation guide to say how in our deliberations we've been thinking about how to apply these criteria to many, many diverse actors who are joining the campaign. So that's where we've got to so far. And as you can, I think, tell from that story, it's not a kind of set of criteria that are fixed in time and then decided, and that's the end of the story. What's really important about it, and I think maybe the most important thing, is that it's a process, and it's indeed a very collaborative process. And this next phase of discussion that we're launching into today is a really important next step in this journey. Because the larger context that we're in here is that we sort of won, if you will, we in the climate action community have won the narrative on making sure people need to see themselves as aligning to what science requires, this deep decarbonization by the middle of the century with immediate action now. But the details of that are, of course, really complicated. And many organizations are trying to figure out what it means for their entities, whether that's a giant multinational corporation or a tiny, small, medium enterprise, whether that's a big city with lots of resources and personnel, or if it's a tiny municipality in a rural area that doesn't even have one person working for them who thinks about climate change as a full-time job. And so thinking about how this huge transformation is going to play out across all those actors and how actors can credibly commit themselves to that journey is a really big challenge. And that's why the process part is just as important in some ways as the substance, because it's going to be a decades-long race that we're now embarked on, and we're going to have the right kind of process around it. In my own view, the Race to Zero campaign actually has a really important role to play in that process, because it can really bring together an unprecedented scope of people, organizations, viewpoints, and perspectives to work together. Here's the radical collaboration part on defining what that frontier of best practice is, and then helping everyone get up to that frontier. And also to make sure people who are falling behind the frontier are shown to be falling behind the frontier. So it has all of these components of helping define best practices, but also holding people to them, and also helping those people who might need a bit more assistance get there. And that's where I'd like to kind of end, because this power, I think, that the people involved, all of you here today, can contribute to this giant challenge of figuring out what a credible pathway to net zero looks like. That's why this is so important. We were really surprised to see, for example, that the summary of the consultations we did way back in this first part of 2020 has been picked up by many different entities looking for what the global state of play on these discussions is. It was, for example, cited in the recent case, the Dutch court case about Shell. And that wasn't ever the intention for the work, but it really shows how people are paying attention to what all of you have to think about this great challenge, and why, if we come together under this banner of Race to Zero to think about defining what that pathway looks like and what credible commitments look like, we're going to actually be able to have a really big impact, not just on the Race to Zero, but on the wider world. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what this next round of consultations is going to bring, how it's going to continue to advance and clarify our thinking on what that frontier of best practice looks like, and to help us all converge upward toward it. So to dive into a bit more details, I'm delighted to be joined by some of my colleagues on the expert peer review group today. I'm going to briefly introduce them and then pass over to the first of them to dive into some of the details a bit more thoroughly. We're joined by Mr. Derek Broekhoff, who is a senior scientist at the Stockholm Environment Institute, a real expert on measuring carbon and how it's put in different places. So we're delighted to hear from Derek. We're also joined by Kira Appleby, who leads CDP's City, States, and Regions team, of course, with a great role on the tracking side, but particularly focused on subnational actors, cities, regions, etc. We're also joined by Dr. Manjot Kaur Ahluwalia, who is a senior program officer at WWF US, where she co-convenes the Alliances for Climate Action. And last but not by no means least is Mr. Nick Blythe, who is the policy and practice lead for the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment. And he also is the convener of the International Organization for Standardization's new Climate Change Coordination Committee. So these are four real experts who I'm delighted to work with on a regular basis on the expert peer review group, who are going to dig into some of the details further. Let me first pass to Derek, if I may. Derek, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. So the first criterion that we're looking for input on through this consultation relates to plans, the planning piece of achieving net zero, I suppose you could say. So currently, all members who join Race to Zero are required to explain within 12 months of joining what actions will be taken toward achieving both interim and longer term pledges, especially the actions that they will take in the short to medium term. And to start off on this topic, I'm going to, if you'll indulge me, engage in a bit of a quip here about the difference between policymakers, engineers, and economists, right, related to this topic. So policymakers will say, you know, the most important thing is to set a target, to make a pledge, keep our eyes on the prize, and we'll figure out how to get to that endpoint. Engineers will say, no, we need to figure out what's possible, and then set a target based on what it's actually possible to achieve, right? And then economists will say, wait a minute, none of this is possible. It's crazy expensive. What are you guys all talking about? Well, we can dispense with the economists, not to knock economists. They can be very useful. It's important to consult them from time to time as we move forward. But what I want to focus on here is the tension between the policymakers and the engineers, right? Because arguably the credibility of any pledge, especially an ambitious pledge, rests on the plausibility of actually being able to achieve it. And so in that respect, you need some kind of plan, a concrete plan, a believable plan. And I would say, you know, not to knock policymakers. There are merits in an approach that says, well, we'll figure out how to get there. But even in that context, I would say you at least need a game plan, right? You need to have some sense of the actions you'll be taking, and in particular, what steps you'll be taking to actually figure out how you're going to achieve your target. So that leads to the guiding question for this public consultation, which is, what are the minimum elements of a credible plan? And I think most people would agree that at a very minimum, entities should be specifying particular actions that they're going to take towards achieving their net zero goals. It should include the timing of those actions. But that's maybe a bare minimum, right? So I think there are other elements to this that one could argue could or should be part of a minimum credible plan, including governance mechanisms around how you're actually going to move forward. So should a minimum plan, a minimum viable, credible plan include, for example, monitoring, reporting, and verification elements? Should it include plans for governance and accountability mechanisms related to the MRV, related to ensuring that actions are indeed being taken according to the plan? Another piece could relate to engagement and buy-in. So, is it sufficient to have just a plan on paper? Should there be evidence of buy-in from directors, from decision makers, from C-level executives, so on and so forth. And then, of course, looking more externally, should there be elements related to communications, stakeholder and workforce engagement, and those kinds of things. So we're really looking for input on what those minimum elements should be. And I would say there's some corollary questions, some related questions that could also be part of this set of considerations here. So, you know, going back to my analogies here, right? For an engineer, there may not be much functional difference between the plans and the targets. The target is simply the endpoint of your plans. Now, not to knock the engineers, I'm kind of making fun of everybody here, but I think most people would say, well, plans, you know, can be and probably should be malleable, right? You want the targets to be fixed, but you also want to be able to adapt as you go along. And so one set of questions here would be, to what extent should entities be held to achieving certain plan elements? Can plans be changed or updated? And should there be criteria and procedures around how you update and adapt plans? What should the procedure, how should we think about these kinds of procedural questions related to the plans versus the targets? And then finally, I would say, you know, just as, you know, a credible pledge rests on having a robust set of plans for how you achieve that pledge, or how you're going to. If you're looking at the next criterion that we're going to talk about, actually taking action, how you evaluate the near-term actions that companies, organizations, different entities may be taking, also links back to the plan. How, you know, are those actions in line with the plans? So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Kira Appleby with CDP, and she will talk some more about that next criterion.
Thanks so much, Derek. I am CDP's Global Director for Cities, States, and Regions, and a member of the expert review panel. CDP has been running a global disclosure system for the past 20 years. So this topic of transparency and reporting is very near and dear to my heart. I'm going to cover two criteria. So the first criteria that I'm going to cover is on action. So currently, the criteria states that participants must take immediate action towards achieving net zero, consistent with delivering their interim targets specified. I think one thing that you have to keep in mind is that this is a very diverse group of actors. There are 23 different routes to join. There's 4,500 participants, and the types of actions that these participants can take are of course varied, and we wouldn't expect a company to take a same act as an investor, or a university or a hospital. So I think the big question for me is, are there, for example, existing standards or protocols across or within initiatives that we could use to assess if that action is considered to be enough to be consistent with the interim target and ultimately the net zero target? And how do you assess that that action is really robust and ambitious enough? Do we need to standardize across the 23 routes? And if so, how could we do that? And how do we assess actions that involve emerging technologies? When we're reviewing the applications, should we ask for evidence of that action? So what if it hasn't occurred yet, but it will in the future? Should we be assessing not only the effectiveness or the ambition of the action, but should we also be looking at the feasibility of the action? And then finally, to what extent should we look at the impacts of the action and take a broader lens and look at the broader impacts of the action? For example, on the communities or the natural environment where the action would take place. And just to give you a sense of the different approaches that some of the different routes use. So in the city's Race to Zero, the cities are asked to select at least one action from a large catalog of actions that cover really diverse focus areas like sustainable food systems or creating inclusive communities. And these actions were put together by a range of organizations that work with cities on climate action and climate planning. So in a different way, on business ambition for 1.5, there is not a specific plan or action that companies need to take, but the campaign commits companies to align with the 1.5 degree future and achieve the net zero value chain emissions before 2050. But there's not one specific action that those companies are asked to take. So there's really different approaches being used by the different routes. And just to understand if there's need for kind of further standardization across them. The second criteria that I'll ask you to look at is around reporting. And now we currently state that participants must commit to report publicly both their progress against interim and long-term targets, as well as actions being taken at least annually. And to the extent possible, they're asked to report via platforms that feed into the Global Climate Action Portal. So again, keeping in mind like the breadth and the variety of the Race to Zero initiatives and routes, and this challenge to get robust global insights across all of them and all these different types of organizations, again, including education providers, healthcare providers, businesses, investors, cities, and state and regional governments. So we're currently asking them to report publicly so that the progress or lack thereof is visible to all. We ask for this right now at least once a year. Is that the right time frame? That is generally the standard for companies and cities and states, but does it make sense in the same way for an education or a healthcare provider? Right now, we're only asking them to report against targets and actions. Is that sufficient? So for example, for an educational institution, would we want them to ask to report not only on the actions that they're taking, but also about, for example, how are they investing their pensions? For businesses, do we want to know not only what they're doing in their direct emissions, but do we also want to ask them about their lobbying efforts or other things that they could be doing that could, I think, counteract the spirit of the Race to Zero? And overall, there's this need to weigh up accountability and credibility with not making the reporting progress too onerous. So my guiding question to you, if you're considering Race to Zero as this umbrella campaign of multiple initiatives, how do you think the progress and the impact of the campaign can best be measured and tracked? So with that, I will hand over to Manjot. Thank you.
Thank you, Kira. Hi, everyone. Really fantastic to be here today with you all. I'm Manjot Ahluwalia, and I work at the World Wildlife Fund, also working on a global initiative, Alliances for Climate Action, with subnational actors at the domestic level on action and advocacy aligned to 1.5C. So very thrilled to have a conversation on integrity on the policy engagement front. As we heard in the beginning, the campaign's 4P starting line criteria of pledge, plan, proceed, and publish definitely lend credibility and transparency to net zero targets. But perhaps we need for these commitments to be backed by integrity so that they are not just a simple check in the box, but rather fully integrated into the daily operations of any organization and including its political engagement strategy. We also need to work in partnership with national governments to get the right enabling policy conditions and 1.5C aligned climate policies to halve the global emissions by 2030. Therefore, proactive engagement of subnational actors on climate policy is needed. So as a leading non-state and subnational actor, you can be a credible and strong messenger in your country and use your voice and influence to join the UN Secretary General and the high-level climate champions in calling on governments to enhance their climate policies ahead of not just COP26, but beyond in this decade of delivery, and make the right choices as we all rebuild and recover from the COVID-19. But using the Race to Zero campaign as an existing platform, I truly believe we can work with our members to reach the next frontier of climate leadership. We want to use this consultation process to ask you whether and how you think your organization or the members you work with might go beyond the target setting, the mitigating emissions, so the pledge, plan, proceed criteria of the campaign, and the disclosing climate risk, the published criterion that Kira just told us about, to engaging in the next frontier, which is policy advocacy, which includes advancing progressive climate policies at the national and subnational level, and aligning internal policies for a fair and inclusive transition to net zero. Well, the good news is there are some examples of existing frameworks that are used by many environmental organizations, which provide and try to steer their members towards proactive climate policy engagement. And I just want to give you some examples across the different constituencies. So for businesses, for example, there is a AAA framework for climate leadership, which is endorsed by EDF, WWF, CDP, Ceres, WRI, the Climate Group, and many other environmental organizations. And it provides guidance to the corporate sector for a science-based climate policy agenda, which consists of 3 elements. And it starts with A, so advocate for policies consistent with net zero emissions by 2050, align your trade associations with climate policy advocacy with a goal of net zero emissions by 2050, and allocate advocacy spending to advance climate policies and not thwart or obstruct them. As another example, as Kira mentioned, is the business ambition for the 1.5C campaign, which is led by the Science Based Targets Initiative, the We Need Business Group, and the UN Global Compact. So what the ambition campaign does is that in addition to asking companies to set and commit to 1.5C science-based or net zero targets, companies endorsing this letter can commit to policy advocacy positions consistent with the 1.5C future, which includes advocating at key international moments and in countries where they operate and have influence. So you're kind of seeing the theme here. We're going beyond just setting and committing to net zero targets to doing more in terms of your next frontier, which is policy advocacy. A very quick example, the city's Race to Zero, which is another partner of the Race to Zero initiative. It invites cities, as Kira mentioned, to publicly endorse the principles of the Race to Zero campaign, which is the 4 Ps. And in addition, it asks for cities to invite their partners, political leaders, CEOs, trade unions, to joining them in recognizing the global climate emergency and deliver on science-based climate action. Well, these are just some examples, and there are plenty more that we would love to hear more from you throughout this consultation. And with this context, the guiding question that we want you to reflect on over the course of the 10-week written consultation process is that what requirements, if any, beyond the existing starting line criteria of the campaign should be made of the members in Race to Zero, which reflects the integrity and the policy engagement that I just gave you some context on. And to guide your thinking, you might want to consider how can the Race to Zero members be supported in implementing these further components? And should the requirements for policy engagement only be required by a particular type of actor? By that, I mean, should it only be required for businesses or for cities, investors, academia, or for everybody? And as you consider these questions, I now pass the floor to my colleague, Nick, who will explore how the Race to Zero members can be best supported in these efforts, as well as members who may not be there yet in terms of how we define policy engagement could be held accountable in a constructive and supported way. So we all are working towards the common goal of halving emissions by 2030. So with that, Nick, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Great, and thanks to all of the colleagues there, and great to be presenting today here. Congratulations to everyone who's involved in the Race to Zero. I certainly commend your hard efforts and the leadership of the Race to Zero partners. I like the concept of radical collaboration, and this is a unique community, and look forward to working with colleagues, seeing how we can support common aim. there's a lot of scrutiny in this, as we know, especially in the context of this current debate around net zero. I'd suggest that transparency is absolutely essential. Also, maybe radical transparency is what is needed to support this direction. So scrutiny, we know, is essential to progress. If I can just give one example, in the United Kingdom, we have an organisation called the Advertising Standards Authority, the ASA, and there have been some cases around earlier corporate claims, carbon neutrality claims, for example, that have fallen foul of the ASA or trading standards. And this area of claims around corporates and products can be contentious. Net zero, of course, is about a future state that we're working towards. And I'd maintain that process integrity and transparency are key in this context. So what do we know? A few points. We know that there is a consensus emerging, it feels, on what net zero is, but there's still wide interpretation. Standards are developing and existing standards help, but they will take time for standards to embed into and across all sectors of the economy that are relevant, and practices developing under these principles. That can be helpful. You can get innovation, but you can also, of course, we know that there is greenwash as a risk as well. So complexity exists in this landscape, and also in the entities. The organizations are complex. So reaching net zero across economies and continents is very much a developmental landscape. So transparency has a key role to play. Examples of complications, we can get into a long discussion about scope 3, for instance, which we know is challenging, and also areas like how boundaries are set for organizations. Gaps and assumptions, how transparent are we about those? Standards absolutely have a role to play, but it's fair to say that they can't cover everything, and there's a real need for narrative explanations alongside standards to help fill in the gaps, and so that stakeholders can see and appreciate the efforts that are being made and are not left suspicious. The need for verification has also been touched on a bit by Derek earlier as well, and that's something that perhaps may well be raised in the consultation. It would be good to see what people feel about how verification takes forward. Figures, data, the narrative reporting alongside data is essential. Figures on their own can be meaningless. We need accompanying explanations. The position of the entity on its journey, the complexities that we've talked about, not just we're following standard X, Y, Z, but what are the gaps that we know about and we know stakeholders would be interested in? This transparent approach feels like the right solution to help organizations as they're on this journey and as the landscape starts to bed down in terms of what the, if you like, the rules of the game are. So following all of that context, Race to Zero clearly want to explore this following guiding question through this consultation. How should Race to Zero members be held accountable for their commitments? And perhaps more importantly, beyond the support of the partner initiatives, how can other entities help members meet their commitments so that everyone is involved in supporting members driving this progress together? And I'll hand back. Thank you at that stage.
Thank you very much to all of the panel members. It's really great to hear all of these guiding questions that will hopefully inspire all the submissions that will be coming in as of today. We have a few minutes to answer some questions. We will not be able to answer all of them due to time, but as said, we promise to answer these then after the meeting in writing and send them to all of you. But maybe just in the benefit of time, Tom, I will pass you two questions. One from Daniel Barlow on whether there should be a light version of Race to Zero for those that want to align but can't meet the criteria. And the second question, which is from Ayman, on whether there is a possibility of some flexibility for those that want to join but have some constraints, in particular for those that come from the Global South. And then we will take a couple of others. Over to you, Tom.
Thanks for these great questions. So I love the Race to Zero metaphor because the race really shows we all need to hurry up and the urgency of the challenge. But it's a kind of funny kind of race because it's a race that we win not when the first person crosses the starting line, but we win when the last person crosses the starting line. This is a race we all need to cross the finish line to win, actually, because we all need to get to a world of net zero. And so this question on what about those who aren't quite at the level of where the frontier best practices, what happens then is a really important one. And I was really pleased to see that in the last round of criteria revisions, the community really focused on this question and added a leadership practice on equity and empowerment, because it speaks exactly to this idea of how Race to Zero is not just about defining the frontier best practice, but also making sure everyone can run up to get to it. And we see some initiatives that are really doing, I think, innovative things to help operationalize that. For example, just to take one example, the C40 Network of Cities has their deadline 2020 commitment. In that commitment, they actually figured out amongst themselves, some of the Global North cities started to go a bit faster to create more time for some of the Global South cities to get up to the 2030 targets, but a 2030 goal. And obviously, many cities in the Global South are urbanizing quickly, are growing in population quickly, so weren't going to be able to have the same kind of 2030 target as a city in the Global North that's maybe at a fixed population or shrinking population. So that kind of solution, I think, is exactly the kind of spirit that we hope this leadership practice will inspire more of. And the EPRG will be asking all Race2Zero members to think about this criterion to really take it to heart. And so I think operationalizing it in these flexible ways makes perfect sense. And doing so along with how we do that in keeping with what the science tells us is the need to get to is the challenge. And I love to see the examples like the one I just said, where organizations are figuring that out. And I hope we can kind of converge and support people to do so through the kind of umbrella of Race2Zero.
Thank you so much, Tom. And I think this issue is for sure something that will be covered in some of the submissions. Let's go to other questions. Again, one question from Ayman, who's asking on more specifics on how the Race2Zero and the work of the Marrakesh Partnership is linked. And maybe that is something more for the Hello to answer. I don't know whether Gonzalo or Nigel, one of you would like to answer. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Kai. Yeah, happy. And thank you, Ayman, for the question. First, I would like to refer to the first origin of the campaign. As Kai explained it initially, this all somehow started with the Climate Ambition Alliance, where the non-state actors with their commitments joined the parties at a common objective of reaching net zero by 2050 at the very latest. When we launched the Climate Ambition Alliance in September 2019 with the leadership of Chile and the UNFCCC and UNDP, we did all the work of the non-party stakeholders with the initiatives that are represented at the Marrakesh Partnership. But then when with Nigel, we launched the Race2Zero a little bit more than 1 year ago. Again, all the work in terms of bringing the partners are almost everything in the Marrakesh Partnership. And this is not only about how practical this is. It's because the Race2Zero is expected also to be one of the main inspirations for the parties to enhance their ambition, to activate the ambition loop, for them to enhance their NDCs. So using not only the role of the high-level champions, but the Marrakesh Partnership as the most important bridge from the non-state actors to the parties and the process, that gives this campaign I would say, the recognition of being at least more formal than any other campaign that exists, but also with the capacity again of showing the parties and the process what is happening and what can happen from the non-state actors. That connection is being made mostly through the Marrakesh Partnership, and that's why it's in the center of the campaign.
Thank you, Gonzalo. And I will just go rapidly to the last question, which is related to net zero and the opportunity of greenwashing related to offsetting. Nigel, maybe you could answer that one. Over to you.
Yes, thank you, Doreen. Really good question. I mean, we're very aware of, I don't think actually net zero creates the opportunity for greenwashing. It exists. I mean, people can bullshit, right? They can say things that they don't really intend to do. Anyway, but I mean, what we're really trying to do with the Race to Zero is have these rigorous criteria, which means that you cannot be in the Race to Zero if you're greenwashing. I mean, what are the main things that people are greenwashing? Long-term targets with no short-term, not in the Race to Zero. Narrow scope, like reducing my operational carbon in my offices, but not in my value chain. Can't do that in the Race to Zero. It's got to be the full value chain. Using offsets, but not reducing your emissions. Can't do that in the Race to Zero. Being unaccountable. Transparency is the key there, but we've got more work to do. I think the point you make about what legal approaches can be taken. I mean, that's why we always talk about the ambition loop. The Race to Zero is not going to solve climate change on its own. It's about driving commitments and action in non-state actors, but we need governments to regulate. Everybody knows that. So that's the legal requirement is for regulation to reduce emissions, regulation for disclosure. So we're trying to accelerate the non-state actor part of the ambition loop and encourage the state actor, the government actor part of the ambition loop to play its part so that between us we get to zero. So just a few thoughts there on how we work specifically to avoid greenwashing through making the Race to Zero the gold standard for credible reduction commitments and actions.
Thank you, Nigel, and thank you all for all your contributions. We are coming to an end, and I would definitely like to give the floor to the champions to some closing remarks. So just to let you all know, other questions will be answered via email. And I would like to thank now the expert peer review members, Tom, Derek, Kira, Manjot, and Nick, and of course the high-level champion for this outline. We hope it has been helpful for you to hear where the campaign currently stands and to present some thoughts and questions on where it might go next. Today, we will be launching all the consultation. You will be seeing now via the chat the written submission form, which will be also shared through the Race to Zero and the UNFCCC website throughout the consultation process. Something to highlight, while we have focused on these 4 key areas that has been presented today, you will also see that in the submission form, there is also scope to add any other issues that you think may not be covered by these 4 areas. So please use that space if you think it's needed. Champions, we really want to hear from you, your honest and constructive thoughts with possibly also solutions to the challenges we are all having. And we would like to ask you to take your time to consider these carefully over the next 10 weeks. We know it's not so much time, but it's enough to give it some thought. Just to recap, this is about discussing how together we can halve emissions by 2030 and ultimately reach a zero carbon economy. We all have a role to play here, and we need to work together to achieve this goal. I wanted to add that recognizing also the recent debates around net zero, and we have heard it today through some of the questions, and the importance and urgency of working in a unified way to halve emissions by 2030, the high-level champions are also convening a climate town hall at the London Climate Action Week on Monday next week. And I think Fiona will be sharing the details through the chat. The event, which is entitled Get Net Zero Right, will reflect on the history of net zero, debate on the current credibility challenges with non-state climate action, and explore the future of net zero efforts ahead of COP26, but definitely also beyond. With that, I will pass on the floor now to the champions for the last words. Over to you, Gonzalo and Nigel.
look, just very briefly, I want to thank the expert peer review group. I mean, it's amazing just to listen to the depth of your expertise and the thoughtfulness with which you frame those questions. I want to thank all of you who have participated. You know, this requires radical collaboration. This is really complex and really important, and we want to get it right. And I want to thank Kai and the Race to Zero team for all the work they've been doing to put this together, and encourage everyone to come along next week. We got some great participants: Jennifer Morgan from Greenpeace, Farhana Amin, one of the first people to really promote net zero like 7-8 years ago, and Tapora Burn, many others. So thank you, everybody. Gonzalo, last word to you.
Thank you, and thank you again to everyone for joining, also for the work that you're doing and for the work that you will continue doing, and the effort that will take this extra effort towards COP and beyond. I think that all of us are moving our work with realism, but also with a lot of optimism on how much this has been changing in the last 2 years, and how much it has accelerated in the last year and a half. And in that sense, I really and honestly think that the glass is full, is half, not only half full, it's half full of air and half full of water. Hopefully no greenhouse emissions in the glass, but it's mostly what I'm saying is that being realistic of how much is here, I notice how much we're progressing, and I feel absolutely confident that with this team and with the transparency, with the openness, and with of course the collaboration that we're embracing, we will continue progressing, noticing that this is permanent, right? Probably will never be perfect, but it's keeping on progressing. So thanks so much, and really looking forward for what we will see in September.
Thank you to all of you. This webinar is closed. Have a nice rest of the day, wherever you are.